Thomas à Kempis's Self-Centered Imitation of Christ, Late Medieval Reflections on Following Jesus, by Greg Peters, Biola University. The Imitation of Christ owes a great debt to both Augustine of Hippo and Bernard of Clairvaux. In both cases, Thomas makes great use of Augustine and Bernard's intuitions regarding one's self-knowledge as a starting point for imitating Jesus. This paper explores the self-centered nature of late medieval spirituality as evidenced in the Imitation of Christ, making suggestions for how it can be appropriated in today's egotistical, self-centered context. But first, a bit of background in biography. Beginning in the 1080s, Western Christian monasticism underwent an exceptional season of expansion and growth. In 1084, Bruno of Cologne founded the Carthusians about 30 miles away from Grenoble, France. And in 1098, Robert of Moulins, who had trained Bruno of Cologne in the monastic life, left his Benedictine community to found a Reformed community at Citeaux, later known as the Cistercians, also in eastern France. In the subsequent decades, other men and women founded new monastic communities and/or monastic orders. The more important foundations for the life and thought of Thomas à Kempis are the Augustinian Hermits and the Canons Regular of Windesheim. The Order of the Hermits of St. Augustine is the result of the actions of Pope Innocent IV, who in 1243 began to combine existing groups of hermits that followed the rule of Augustine, a work completed by his successor Alexander IV with the so-called Great Union of 1256. These hermits were changed into a mendicant, that is, a begging order, charged with pastoral care and theological education. Over a century later, several years after the death of their founder, Gert Groot, a group called the Brothers of the Common Life quickly set to work to fulfill one of Groot's wishes, founding a monastery. In the words of one of his followers, quote, 3 years after the death of Master Groot, Master Flourens and his companions began to build a monastery in Windesheim, and some of the disciples of Master Flourens moved to Windesheim with his permission. Near Zwolle, on land donated to them, 5 brothers began building a church and temporary living quarters, which were dedicated on October 17, 1387. The monks gave themselves over to manual labor, such as copying books for the library and choir, but lived mostly as solitaries. Over the first years, the numbers of brothers in the monastery grew steadily. Construction projects abounded, and benefactors generously supported the monastery. By 1392, the community was founding its first daughter house. From here, growth was phenomenal. So much so that by the end of the 15th century, there were nearly 100 communities of men and women. Though the congregation died out in the early modern period, it played a significant role in late medieval monastic reform, not least because it was not an outgrowth of an existing order, but a new foundation emerging from the world of the laity. It was into this monastic context that Thomas à Kempis was born. Thomas was born in Kempen, in the Lower Rhine, between September 29, 1379, and July 24, 1380, in what is now Germany. His father was a craftsman, and his mother was likely a teacher. Thomas was initially educated in Kempen, but as a teenager, sometime around 1393, he studied in Deventer with the Brothers of the Common Life for 5 or 6 years. The choice of Deventer seems due to the presence of his brother John in the community there. It is not surprising, then, that when Thomas finished his education, he would, in 1399, enter the community of the regular canons at Mount St. Agnes near Zwolle. Though Thomas entered the community in 1399, he did not make final profession until 1407, and he was ordained a priest between July 26, 1413, and July 24, 1414. Almost without exception, Thomas spent the remainder of his life at Mount St. Agnes, primarily writing and copying books, and on 2 occasions, serving as sub-prior. As a priest, he also would have regularly offered Mass and participated in the full liturgical horarium of the community. Further, he did serve as novice master, resulting in a series of talks for novices arranged as a dialogue. He died in 1471. Thomas's literary output is vast, and there are still texts attributed to him that are disputed by scholars today. The most famous and well-known work, of course, is the Imitation of Christ, which was securely attributed to Thomas only in the 20th century. Likely begun by Thomas in his mid-40s, The imitation is a mature presentation of his understanding of what it means to imitate Jesus as a fully formed, devout convert. The text is not necessarily all that original, for it depends heavily on the preceding Christian spiritual tradition, but this did not stop it from becoming one of the most well-read books in Christian history. The imitation was so popular, in fact, that there were approximately 50 editions printed before 1500, which is less than 30 years after Thomas's death. Concerning the Christian spiritual tradition, from which Thomas borrowed, one of its great ironies is that overcoming the sin of self-love actually requires self-knowledge. That is, we move beyond ourselves by attention to ourselves. Thomas accepted this premise and appears to be working within a Cistercian framework in this regard. In his On Loving God, Bernard of Clairvaux, who died in 1153, wrote that there are 4 degrees of love. The first, a person loves himself for his own sake. The second degree, a person loves God for one's own advantage. Third degree of love is that a person loves God for God's sake. And lastly, the fourth and highest degree of love, a person loves himself for the sake of God. All love has God as its source, for he is, to quote Bernard, the efficient and final cause of our love. God offers the opportunity, creates the affection, and consummates the desire. Moreover, Bernard continues, love is not imposed by a precept, it is planted in nature, making it possible for all persons to know themselves and in this way come to love themselves, albeit selfishly. Nonetheless, it is this initial self-love that sets one on course to come, with God's grace, to a knowledge of God. Again, to quote Bernard, in this way, man, who is animal and carnal and knows how to love only himself, yet starts loving God for his own benefit, because he learns from frequent experience that he can do everything that is good for him in God, and that without God he can do nothing good. Not everyone comes to the 4th degree of love, but everyone has the same opportunity to begin the journey by way of self-knowledge and self-love. Thus, the most necessary kind of knowledge for the person being spiritually formed is self-knowledge. Again, in the words of Bernard, there are 2 facts you should know. First, what you are. Secondly, that you are not that by your own power, lest you fail to boast at all or do so in vain. Know yourself. Well, knowledge itself is a gift of God, concludes Thomas, especially when that knowledge comes from truth itself, and not just from signs and passing words. But knowledge for knowledge's sake alone often just leads to controversy and makes the devout person, quote, deliberately turn to curious and harmful things, which is supreme folly, thinks Thomas. In the end, true learning, he goes on to say, is good in itself and ordained by God, but a good conscience and a holy life are always to be preferred. Further, Thomas thinks that a humble knowledge of oneself is a surer road to God than a deep searching of the sciences. Knowledge of the mysteries of God is always preferable to knowledge of the sciences. For Thomas, there is a direct correlation between what you know and the severity of God's judgment, for knowledge is primarily for the sake of one's growth in holiness. Thus, the holy Christian will restrain an inordinate desire for knowledge, writes Thomas, and will mostly turn her rational faculty towards knowing herself, for it is in self-knowledge that one can begin the journey to union with God, in keeping with the thought of Bernard of Clairvaux. By coming to know oneself, the devout Christian is able to address her inordinate desires and understand rightly the laws and commandments of God. True knowledge is purifying, for it brings to light those things that need eradication through self-denial, for what the mind, through knowledge, quote, conceives as desirable, is always to be desired, and sought only in the fear of God and with a humble heart. Reciprocally, the more one grows in holiness, the more he is able to understand. As well, God has not left the devout person on her own, says Thomas, but provides wise counsel through others in order to bring forth greater godly knowledge. Take counsel of a wise and conscientious man, he writes, and seek to be guided by one who is better than yourself, rather than follow your own opinions. And, he continues, ask counsel of one who is wise and fears God. Such submission to a spiritual elder rests on the virtues of obedience and silence, for talkativeness is a vice, thinks Thomas. The one who desires to grow in holiness only speaks to edify others, and it is only devout conversation, Thomas says, on spiritual matters that greatly furthers spiritual progress. And it is only in silence and quietness that the devout soul learns the hidden mysteries of the Scriptures. But the Scriptures must not be read to satisfy curiosity or to pass time, but instead to move one's heart to devotion, to use the language of Thomas. Importantly for Thomas, this silence and quietude invokes a love of solitude, since it creates the space necessary for meditation on holy things. Such solitude is not only an imitation of the great saints, but it is also an imitation of Jesus himself, who withdrew from crowds. The devout Christian must withdraw into her own inner cell. Though a monastic, Thomas did not limit the concept of cell to the monk's physical cell in the monastery. Rather, and perhaps more importantly, everyone has an inner cell, so that every believer can withdraw into solitude at any time, and even find delight in dwelling there. This makes it possible to avoid preoccupation with worldly affairs, creating the space for peace and tranquility that leads to thinking only on divine and salutary things, says Thomas. Keeping one's mind in the world leads to a disquieted heart, but he who withdraws has God near to him. As mentioned before, one of the issues that lies at the root of an inability to renounce desire is self-love. Though the Scriptures command love of God and love of neighbor, self-love makes this difficult, for, quote, seldom is anyone so spiritual as to strip himself entirely of self-love. Moreover, love of self hinders the devout person's ability to stand in obedience to God and his commandments, and ultimately leads to a multitude of other sins, including pride. So, self-love must be dealt with if one expects to progress spiritually. Thomas writes, if you aspire to reach this height of perfection, you must make a brave beginning. Lay the axe to the roots, to cut out and destroy all inordinate and secret love of self, and of any personal and material advantage. From this vice of inordinate self-love spring nearly all those other failings that have to be completely overcome. Thomas's words against self-love get at the root of humankind's sin sickness, for self-love hurts the devout person more than anything else in the world. Thomas acknowledges that everything imprisons the heart to some degree, and that imprisonment is in direct proportion to the degree of love that one has for that thing. In an Augustinian sense, distorted love is not one kind of love, but it is the love of something in a twisted way. For example, it is good to love a friend, but not for himself or for his sake, but for God's sake. Love, for Augustine, is synonymous with the Holy Spirit, who is the divine love that both is God and comes from God. Love moves believers to appreciate and desire God above everything else, and to love self, neighbor, and all lower goods for the sake of God's goodness. Again, to quote Augustine, every human being, qua human being, should be loved on God's account, and God should be loved for himself. Thus, there can be a kind of proper self-love, but only if that self-love moves beyond the self to God. As Oliver O'Donovan rightly notes, quote, the idea of self-love in St. Augustine of Hippo constitutes a problem. Self-love is loving God, it is also hating God. Love of self that results in love of God is a rightly ordered love, but self-love that ends at the self demonstrates hatred towards God. Thomas is concerned with the latter. It appears for Thomas that self-love manifests itself through our desire to want to possess things, and to subject ourselves to them to such an extent that we become their slave. This care about things shows that we are not putting our trust in God, and by extension shows our lack of love for God. Though Thomas does not reach this conclusion explicitly, such a perspective suggests that poverty, of both material things and also of the spirit, a la Matthew 5, verse 3, would be rooted in a correct love of God. Poverty is evidence of trust in God wholeheartedly, as is love of God. That is, someone who loves God well does not exhaust herself with grief or burden herself with needless anxieties. Rather, she trusts God's goodwill towards her, freeing herself from the things that keep her from loving God. As Thomas writes, our advantage does not consist in winning or increasing possessions, It lies rather in being indifferent to such things and eradicating the desire for them from our hearts. This inordinate need for other things draws us away from God, and they become the focus of our love, which is actually an expression of our self-love, because we wrongly assume that we cannot live without them. Without love for God, obedience to Him is out of the question. Thus, the devout person must conquer self, says Thomas, especially one's self-love, to advance in holiness. In the medieval church, pride was the greatest vice and the root of all other sins. Thomas Aquinas, for example, thinks that pride is the most grievous of sins. That being the case, humility then becomes the greatest virtue, exemplified by Jesus Christ Himself in the Incarnation. Quote, "Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though He was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but made Himself nothing, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, He humbled Himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore God has highly exalted Him, and bestowed on Him the name that is above every name." Thomas first situates humility as a positive result of knowing one's faults. Quote, "It is often good for us that others know and expose our faults, for so we may be kept humble." Instead of relying on oneself, the devout person will submit herself to God and make light of those who may speak against her. She will welcome this because in knowing her faults, she knows whom she has offended and can be reconciled to them. Such transparency and vulnerability is the result of humility, whom God loves and protects. It is the humble that God exalts, an imitation of Christ. It is to the humble that God reveals His secrets and lovingly calls and draws him to Himself. Humility in light of one's faults allows the believer to know the truth and to be set free by the truth, because he will no longer be living self-deceived about his own spiritual progress. Truth with humility reminds the devout person that he must not boast, but rather be ashamed, remembering his sinfulness, that he is weighed down by his passions. In the end, truly humble disciples always tend to nothing, to quote Thomas. Thomas acknowledges that the devout person may be tempted to boast about her devotion, that is, that she has received the grace of devotion. Therefore, Thomas advises her to think more humbly of herself, recognizing instead that this grace has been given to one desperately in need of it. In other words, she has been given this grace because she is unworthy, and without it she would be sad and needy. She has not merited it through any goodness or worthiness of her own, but only through God's goodness. Somewhat ironically, Thomas believes that one's spiritual progress, quote, "consists not so much in enjoying the grace of consolation as in bearing its withdrawal with humility, resignation, and patience." Moreover, a devout person's merit is on display, in part when he is grounded in humility by his low esteem and honest appreciation of himself, says Thomas. And Thomas goes on to say, and by his preference for humiliation and despite rather than honors at the hands of men. The disciple recognizes that she is but dust and acid and ashes, so she humbles herself and acknowledges her nothingness before God. The depth of this humiliation is captured well when Thomas writes that, quote, "the last trace of self-esteem be engulfed in the depth of my nothingness. For I am nothing, and by myself I am nothing." Such radical self-loathing, perverse self-love, in Thomas's language, is not rooted in a twisted psychosis, but in a conviction that one sees oneself most clearly when one knows God most properly. In yet another moment of dependence on Augustine of Hippo, Thomas says, quote, "by lovingly seeking you alone, I have found both myself and you." In human debasement, God is lifted up and exalted, and human nature is viewed properly. Quote, "how humble and insignificant I am. I acknowledge my utter nothingness. I recognize myself as wholly and only nothing." Well, in the believer's nothingness and from her humility, the devout believer understands that her only hope in life and death is to call upon God, asking Him to make her into something from nothing, a creation ex nihilo. From the same place of humility and nothingness, however, she is able to shun worldly honors and advancement. Deceived by vanity, the disciple seeks affirmation from the people and things of the earth, finding in them only a false peace, for true peace comes from God alone. But Thomas goes further by reminding the disciple that even one's friends and family must be despised if one wants to truly imitate Christ. For, quote, if anyone comes after Christ and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be Christ's disciples. The devout person mortifies his familial affection and foregoes human companionship because there is a direct correlation between affection for others and affection for God. In the words of Thomas, the disciple, quote, draws nearer to God as he withdraws further from the consolations of this world. And the deeper he descends into himself and the lower he regards himself, the higher he ascends to God. Language again that echoes Augustine of Hippo. And this sense of going into oneself leads to perhaps the most important justification for the ongoing relevance of the imitation, in that it overcomes the implicit, yet false dichotomy in modern religious thinking between one's personal, albeit subjective spirituality, and an institution, such as the Roman Catholic Church. Though conceptions of the self were not unknown in antiquity and early Christian history, it was only in the 12th century that it came again to the foreground. In the 12th century, there was a renewed commitment to examining the inner life and differing ways of understanding the self. The rediscovery of the self caused the confessional and penitential system to be more introspective. It brought about the return of the genre of autobiography and the rise of portraiture in art, for example. But this return to the self was especially present in theological, spiritual literature. For example, Bernard of Clairvaux, preaching to Cistercian monks on the steps of confession, explained that the first step was expressed in the well-known Delphic precept, human being, know yourself. This self-knowledge, writes Bernard, has three elements to it. Quote, that people know what they have done, what they have deserved, and what they have lost. Similarly, when offering advice to Pope Eugenius III, who was also a Cistercian, Bernard told the Pope, quote, now in order to achieve the fruit of consideration, I think you should consider four things in this order. Yourself, what is below you, around you, and above you. Your consideration should begin with yourself, so you do not reach out to other things in vain, because you have neglected yourself. Therefore, Bernard concludes, let your consideration begin and end in yourself. Bernard's Cistercian confrere, Alred of Rivaux, even asked, how great is man's knowledge when he does not even grasp himself? And there is perhaps no greater high medieval proponent of self-knowledge than Dante, who says that the one who hopes to see God in paradise must turn and see his own familiar shores before ascending to God. But knowing oneself is not about self-realization, much less tapping into one's inner self to unlock one's own native spirituality. No, this inner knowledge is of the Augustinian kind. That is, it is in knowing oneself that makes it possible for one to know God. Even in pagan Gnosticism, self-knowledge was an essential element of spirituality. Quote, by awakening to knowledge, the Gnostic knows reality as it really is, the fullness as it proceeds from the unknowable. It is to this fullness of the true all that the Gnostic returns. When the Gnostic makes contact with the light deposited in his soul and totally identifies with it, that is, self-knowledge, he is back at the place he came from. The Father, who is himself the place of repose from which all the worlds, times, and spaces have emanated. There, everything finds rest. In this understanding, spirituality is an awakening that begins within oneself to unlock the knowledge, the gnosis that lies within. Christian spirituality, on the other hand, begins with self-knowledge for the purpose of getting outside of oneself and back to God. God is not within the human person in this Gnostic sense, but outside the human person. Self-knowledge and interiority, the kind of Augustine and Thomas, serve the greater purpose of helping the devout follower move outside of herself and then exitus, an exit, in order to return, reditus, to God. It is God who makes it possible for the believer to love, for God is the efficient and final cause. All things come from God as Creator and Savior, and all that exists is made to return. Creation returns in its praise to God, and humans return in union with God in eternal blessedness. Thus, the inner subjective turn in Christian spirituality is ultimately a return to God, not a deep dive into one's own inner being that then becomes the fount of all spirituality. Rather, according to Thomas, it is a self-centered imitation of Christ. Thank you.